In a quiet suburban neighborhood of Minneapolis, where autumn leaves painted the streets in warm colors, 17-year-old Michael noticed an elderly woman struggling with her TV remote through her living room window. He was walking home from basketball practice, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, when he saw her frustrated gestures through the glass. Most teenagers would have kept walking, their eyes glued to their phones, but something made Michael pause. Maybe it was the way she reminded him of his own grandmother, or perhaps it was simply the kind voice that answered when he knocked on her door to offer help. Mrs. Henderson, a 78-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood for over 4 decades, initially hesitated but then welcomed him inside with a grateful smile. "These new gadgets, they're not made for old fingers," she chuckled nervously, holding out 3 different remotes. The TV screen flickered with static, and Michael could see the confusion in her eyes. As a tech-savvy teenager who helped run his school's computer club, this was exactly the kind of problem he could solve. Over the next hour, Michael not only fixed her TV settings but also patiently taught her how to use the remote, writing down step-by-step instructions in large, clear letters on a notepad. Mrs. Henderson offered him cookies and told stories about the neighborhood from when she first moved in. She reminded him so much of his own grandmother that he found himself sharing stories about his college dreams and his passion for computer science. Before leaving, Michael programmed her remote to make it simpler to use and gave her his mother's phone number, telling her to call if she needed any more help. The smile on Mrs. Henderson's face made his whole day better. He walked home feeling good about himself, thinking this was just another random act of kindness in his day. But the next afternoon, as Michael was helping his little sister with her homework, a police car pulled up outside their house. His mother looked out the window with concern, and Michael felt his heart skip a beat. What could the police want? He hadn't done anything wrong, or had he? His mind raced back to the previous day at Mrs. Henderson's house. As he opened the front door, he saw Mrs. Henderson standing next to 2 police officers, but something was different about her expression. She wasn't afraid or angry. She was beaming. In her hands, she held what looked like an envelope, and behind her, several news cameras were setting up their equipment. The story that unfolded next would shake their small community and challenge long-held prejudices. It would remind people that in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can build the strongest bridges. But as Michael stood in his doorway that afternoon, he had no idea that his decision to help an elderly neighbor with her TV would spark a chain of events that would touch thousands of lives. What happened next would not only change Michael's life forever, but would also become a powerful testament to the importance of looking beyond appearances and reaching out to help others, regardless of age, race, or background. As the officers stepped forward, their faces serious but their eyes kind, Michael realized that this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. In a world where negative news often dominates headlines, what transpired on that ordinary suburban street would soon capture hearts across the nation. But standing there in his doorway, Michael couldn't have known that his simple act of kindness was about to transform not just his life, but his entire community's perspective on what it means to be a good neighbor. The question wasn't just why Mrs. Henderson had returned with the police. It was what would happen next that would truly leave everyone speechless. The first police officer, Sergeant Thompson, a tall woman with kind eyes, stepped forward and cleared her throat. Michael's mother had joined him at the door, her hand protectively resting on his shoulder. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Mrs. Henderson couldn't contain her smile any longer. "Is this the young man?" Sergeant Thompson asked, though it was clear from Mrs. Henderson's enthusiastic nodding that she already knew the answer. Michael noticed a local news van pulling up behind the police car, and his confusion only grew. What had started as a simple act of helping a neighbor was turning into something much bigger than he could have imagined. "This is him," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice filled with emotion. "The young man who didn't just fix my TV. He gave me back my independence." She turned to Michael, her eyes glistening with tears. "You see, that television was my last connection to my late husband, George. We used to watch our favorite shows together every evening. After he passed, I couldn't bear to change anything about it, even when it started acting up." For months, I sat there with a broken TV, feeling more alone than ever. The second officer, Officer Rodriguez, stepped forward with a small notebook. Mrs. Henderson called the precinct this morning, but not to file a complaint. She wanted to nominate you for our Community Bridge Builders Award. It's a special recognition we give to citizens who go above and beyond to help others and strengthen our community bonds. Michael's mother squeezed his shoulder, and he could feel her pride radiating through her touch. The local news reporter, Sarah Chin, had set up her camera and was watching the scene unfold with genuine interest. But there was more to this story than just an award nomination. Mrs. Henderson opened the envelope she was holding. After you left yesterday, I found something while looking through my old photos. She pulled out a yellowed photograph that made everyone gathered there gasp in surprise. The image showed two young men in baseball uniforms, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. "This is my husband, George." She pointed to one of the young men. "And this," her finger moved to the other figure, "is William Thomas, your grandfather." Michael stared at the photograph in disbelief. His grandfather, who had passed away before Michael was born, stood frozen in time alongside Mrs. Henderson's husband. They played minor league baseball together in the 1960s. Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice thick with emotion. They were best friends during one of the most difficult times in our country's history. Their friendship faced criticism and even threats, but they never let it break their bond. When I saw you at my door yesterday, it was like history repeating itself in the most beautiful way. The news cameras were rolling now, capturing this unexpected connection between past and present. But this revelation was just the beginning of a much larger story that was about to unfold. Sarah Chen, the reporter, stepped forward with her microphone, ready to ask questions about this remarkable coincidence. But there was something in her expression that suggested she knew there was even more to this story than met the eye. As Michael held the photograph, studying his grandfather's face, Mrs. Henderson placed a gentle hand on his arm. "There's something else you need to know," she said softly. "Something your grandfather and my husband did together that changed this town forever. But first, there's someone else you should meet." She turned and gestured toward a car that had just pulled up to the curb. An elderly man stepped out, leaning heavily on a cane, his weathered face breaking into a wide smile as he caught sight of the gathering. Michael noticed his mother's sharp intake of breath, and when he looked at her, he saw recognition flash across her face. Who was this man, and what role did he play in this increasingly extraordinary story? The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the weight of untold histories and connections waiting to be uncovered. As the elderly man made his way slowly toward them, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his simple decision to help with a TV repair was about to reveal a chapter of his family's history he never knew existed. A chapter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his community's past and its path to the present. The elderly man stopped a few feet away, tears streaming down his face as he looked at Michael. "You look just like him," he said softly, though who he was referring to remained unclear. The cameras continued rolling, capturing this moment of mystery and emotion, as everyone present sensed that they were about to witness the unfolding of a story that had been waiting decades to be told. The elderly man who had just arrived was Robert Turner, a former civil rights activist and local legend whose name Michael had only heard in his history teacher's passionate retellings of their town's past. Turner's eyes never left Michael's face as he slowly made his way to the group, each step deliberate and weighted with purpose. "Your grandfather," Turner began, his voice carrying the rich texture of years of storytelling, "along with George Henderson and I, we did something in 1963 that this town wasn't ready for. Something that got buried in the pages of history, but its impact rippled through generations." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, folded newspaper clipping. The yellowed paper trembled in his hands as he carefully unfolded it. The headline read, "Local baseball players stand against segregation." Below it was another photograph, this one showing three young men, Michael's grandfather, Mrs. Henderson's husband, and a younger Robert Turner, standing in front of what appeared to be a community center. Sarah Chen, the reporter, had moved closer, her camera operator capturing every word, every expression. The police officers initially there to present an award now stood captivated by the unfolding story. Officer Rodriguez had pulled out his phone and was quickly searching through historical archives, his eyes widening at what he discovered. That community center, Mrs. Henderson picked up the story, her voice gaining strength, was supposed to be torn down. It was the only place in town where people of all backgrounds could gather freely. Your grandfather and George organized a baseball game that changed everything. She paused, looking at Turner, who nodded encouragingly. Michael's mother squeezed his shoulder tighter, and he could feel her trembling. "Mom?" he questioned softly, but she just shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. She had never told him this story, and now he understood why. Some memories are too powerful, too precious to trust to casual conversation. Turner stepped forward, his cane tapping softly on the concrete. "We organized a mixed-race baseball game right there on that community center's field. It was illegal at the time, but we did it anyway. Your grandfather was the mastermind, Michael. He believed that sports could bring people together when nothing else could." Officer Thompson had moved to her patrol car and returned with what looked like an official document. The tension in the air grew thicker as she held it, waiting for the right moment to reveal its contents. The gathered crowd, which had grown to include several neighbors, leaned in closer. "But there's more," Turner continued, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in even closer. "That game led to something bigger, something that shaped this town's future. And yesterday, Michael, when you helped Mrs. Henderson with her TV, you unknowingly stepped into a legacy that's been waiting for you." Sarah Chen raised her hand slightly, a journalist's instinct telling her that an even bigger story was about to break. "Mr. Turner," she began carefully, "are you saying that this isn't just about a teenager helping an elderly neighbor? That there's a connection to the civil rights movement?" Turner smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Young lady, what happened yesterday and what's about to happen today is going to remind this town of something it started to forget. You see, that community center, it's still standing. And today, it's about to face the same threat it did 60 years ago." Officer Thompson stepped forward with her document, and Mrs. Henderson reached for another envelope in her bag. Michael stood there, his heart pounding, realizing that his simple act of kindness had somehow connected him to a crucial piece of his family's history, and perhaps to his community's future. The autumn wind picked up, scattering leaves around their feet as Turner pulled one final photograph from his wallet. "Before I show you this," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "you need to understand what your grandfather wrote on the back of it. Words that have guided many of us for decades. Words that, by some miracle, you lived out yesterday without even knowing their existence." As Turner began to turn the photograph over, Mrs. Henderson's hand flew to her mouth, and Officer Thompson gripped her document tighter. Whatever was written on the back of that photograph, whatever was in that official police document, and whatever Mrs. Henderson had in her envelope, it was all connected, and it was about to change everything. The cameras continued rolling as Turner's trembling fingers began to reveal the handwritten message, and Michael felt the weight of history and destiny converging in this single moment. The tension had reached its peak, and the truth was finally about to emerge. The message on the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, read, "When bridges seem broken, be the one to extend your hand first. The greatest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness." The words, written by Michael's grandfather, seemed to hang in the air as Turner carefully passed the photograph to Michael. But before Michael could fully process the weight of these words, Officer Thompson stepped forward with her document. "This morning, we received notice that the old community center is scheduled for demolition next week. The city council voted on it last night, citing structural concerns." She paused, her expression grave. "What they don't know is that Mrs. Henderson here has been quietly collecting evidence of the building's historical significance." Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she opened her envelope, revealing a stack of papers. "I've been gathering signatures, photographs, and testimonials for months, but I couldn't get them to the Historical Society because my arthritis." She looked at Michael with tears in her eyes. "When you helped me with my TV yesterday, you didn't just fix a machine. You gave me the courage to ask for help with something much bigger." Sarah Chen, the reporter, was rapidly taking notes as the story took another unexpected turn. "Are you saying that the same community center that faced demolition in 1963 is once again under threat? And somehow, this young man's act of kindness is connected to its potential salvation?" Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A woman in a business suit stepped out, holding a leather briefcase. The crowd parted as she walked toward them, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. "I'm Catherine Powell, from the State Historical Society," she announced, her eyes scanning the gathered crowd. "We received an unusual number of calls this morning about this property." Michael's mother gasped softly. "Catherine, you're Richard Powell's daughter, aren't you?" The woman nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Your father, he was the judge who protected the community center in '63. Turner straightened up, his eyes shining. "That's not all. Show them what's in your grandfather's letter, Michael. The part we haven't revealed yet." Michael looked at him confused. He hadn't been shown any letter. Mrs. Henderson reached into her bag one last time, pulling out an envelope that looked like it had been sealed for decades. "Your grandfather left this with George," she explained. "It was meant to be opened when the community center faced its next great challenge. For 60 years, we've protected it, waiting for the right moment." She held out the envelope to Michael, its edges worn with age. As Michael reached for the letter, Officer Rodriguez's phone suddenly buzzed. He looked at the screen, his eyes widening. The city council. They'd called an emergency meeting. Someone leaked the story about the historical significance, and he looked up at the group. "They're waiting for us. All of us." Catherine Powell stepped forward, her expression serious. "Before we go, there's something everyone needs to understand about the legal implications of what's in that letter. Your grandfather and Judge Powell, they put something in motion back then, a kind of failsafe, but it only works if—" She was interrupted by the sudden arrival of another vehicle. This time, an elderly man in a wheelchair was being helped out by his nurse. The crowd fell silent as they recognized him, former Mayor Thomas Wright, now 95 years old, who had been in office during the 1963 crisis. "I saw it on the news," he said, his voice weak but clear. "That boy. He doesn't just look like his grandfather. He's made the same choice at the same crossroads." He wheeled himself closer to Michael, who still held the unopened letter. "But before you open that, son, you need to know what really happened the day after that baseball game. The part that never made it into the history books." The autumn sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the gathered crowd. The letter in Michael's hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Whatever was inside would clearly do more than just save a building. It would reveal a truth that had been carefully guarded for over half a century. Sarah Chen's camera operator adjusted his equipment, making sure to capture every detail of this unfolding drama. The entire town would soon learn that Michael's simple act of helping with a TV had unleashed a chain of events that would force them to confront their past and decide their future. But first, they needed to hear what Mayor Wright had kept secret for all these years, and discover what Michael's grandfather had written in that carefully preserved letter. As Michael began to break the seal, his hands trembling slightly, Mayor Wright raised his hand. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying an urgency that made everyone freeze. "There's something you all need to understand about what happened the night after that baseball game. Something that changes everything about what's happening right now." Former Mayor Wright's eyes filled with tears as he began to speak, his voice growing stronger with each word. "That night, after the baseball game, the community center caught fire. Everyone assumed it was retaliation, but what they didn't know was that your grandfather and George Henderson had already anticipated this. They had spent weeks secretly fireproofing the building's main structure." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, completing the story. What looked like destruction from the outside actually revealed something hidden within the walls. Hundreds of letters, documents, and photographs. Evidence of our town's secret network of people who had been working together across racial lines for decades. The fire that was meant to destroy actually preserved our true history. Michael's hands steadied as he finally opened his grandfather's letter. As he unfolded the yellowed paper, something metallic fell out. A key, old and brass, its surface worn with age. The letter itself contained just one sentence. The truth isn't in what burned, but in what was rebuilt. Catherine Powell quickly opened her briefcase, pulling out architectural plans. This morning, when we received the calls, I had our team pull the original building records. The community center wasn't just rebuilt after the fire. It was transformed. Your grandfather and Judge Powell designed it to be a time capsule, its walls literally filled with our town's real history. Officer Thompson stepped forward with her document, which now took on new meaning. The demolition order. It isn't just about tearing down a building. According to these plans, if the building is demolished, everything hidden inside its walls will be destroyed. We're not just fighting to save a building. We're fighting to preserve the truth. Just then, Officer Rodriguez's phone buzzed again. His face broke into a wide smile as he read the message. The city council meeting. They just voted. The demolition is suspended, but there's more. They want us, all of us, to come to the community center right now. They're calling an emergency town meeting. As the group made their way to the community center, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. News vans followed their impromptu procession, and more townspeople joined them along the way, drawn by the spreading story. Michael walked between Mrs. Henderson and Robert Turner, the brass key heavy in his pocket. At the community center, they found the city council members already waiting, along with a team of historical preservation experts. But when Michael stepped forward with the key, Mrs. Henderson gently stopped him. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, her voice trembling. "Your grandfather left instructions about this moment. The key isn't just for one lock. It's for a choice." Robert Turner explained, "There are 2 doors hidden within these walls. One leads to the historical documents that would legally protect this building forever. The other," he paused, looking at Michael intently, "leads to something your grandfather believed was even more important. Proof that this town's healing started long before that baseball game and continues through simple acts of kindness like fixing an elderly woman's TV." Michael stood before the building's main wall, where subtle markings indicated 2 potential keyholes, cleverly disguised within the architecture. The choice was his: unlock the legal protection that would save the building, or reveal the deeper truth about how change really happens in a community. As he stepped forward, key in hand, Catherine Powell suddenly spoke up. "Wait. According to my father's records, this moment was prophesied in a way. The choice had to be made by someone who proved their character before knowing their legacy. But there's something else." She pulled out one final document, her hands shaking as she read it. "The key, it's not just a key. It's a symbol of something your grandfather and my father encoded into this building's very foundation." The crowd held its breath as Michael stood before the wall, the weight of history and future balanced on his decision. But just as he began to move toward one of the keyholes, Mrs. Henderson gasped. In the fading sunlight, something remarkable became visible on the wall. A pattern that only appeared at this exact time of day, on this exact date, revealing a truth that would transform their understanding of not just the past, but of how communities heal and grow. The key in Michael's hand caught the last ray of sunlight, and in that moment, everything became clear. His simple act of kindness hadn't just connected him to his grandfather's legacy. It had completed a circle that began long before any of them were born, and would continue long after they were gone. But first, he had to make the right choice, and as he stepped forward one final time, the entire town held its breath, waiting to see which truth would finally be revealed. In that pivotal moment, Michael understood what his grandfather had known all along. The choice between legal protection and deeper truth was no choice at all. As the sunlight revealed a 3rd keyhole, hidden in plain sight between the other 2, he realized both doors needed to be opened together. The key in his hand wasn't meant to choose between history and healing. It was designed to connect them. With Mrs. Henderson on one side and Robert Turner on the other, Michael inserted the key into the central lock. As he turned it, a mechanism whirred to life, and both hidden doors slowly opened, revealing not just documents and photographs, but mirrors, dozens of them, strategically placed to reflect the gathering crowd's faces alongside the historical artifacts. "Your grandfather," Mayor Wright said softly, believed that preserving history wasn't enough. We needed to see ourselves in it, to understand that every small action, every moment of kindness, becomes part of a larger story. The mirrors created an endless reflection of past and present, with the gathered community members seeing their own faces alongside the preserved documents and photographs. Catherine Powell moved through the revealed space, her professional composure breaking as she examined the contents. "This is unprecedented," she breathed. "These documents don't just prove the building's historical significance. They show how everyday people kept hope alive through simple acts of kindness, just like what Michael did yesterday." The city council members, who had arrived expecting to debate a building's fate, found themselves witnessing something far more meaningful. The mayor stepped forward, emotion clear in her voice as she made an announcement. "This isn't just a historical site anymore. As of today, we're designating the community center as our town's first living history museum of community connection." Sarah Chin, who had been documenting everything, lowered her camera and wiped tears from her eyes. "This isn't just a local story anymore," she said. "This is about how history doesn't just happen in big moments. It happens in small acts of kindness that ripple through generations." Mrs. Henderson reached for Michael's hand. "When you helped me with my TV yesterday, you weren't just fixing a machine. You were proving what your grandfather always said, that the strongest bridges between people are built one small kindness at a time." As the sun set completely, the community center's old lights flickered on, illuminating the faces of young and old, of different backgrounds and beliefs, all united in this unexpected moment of connection. The mirrors continued their endless reflection, showing not just who they were, but who they could become. Michael's mother, who had been quietly watching everything unfold, finally spoke. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said, pulling him close, "not just because you finished what he started, but because you proved his greatest belief, that the power to change things always begins with the choice to be kind." In the weeks that followed, the community center became more than just a preserved historical site. It became a living reminder that every person has the power to make a difference, that every small act of kindness carries the potential to heal old wounds and build new bridges. Michael's story, and the larger history it unveiled, became part of the town's curriculum, teaching future generations that the most powerful changes often start with the simplest choices. And as for Michael and Mrs. Henderson, they still meet every Sunday to watch TV together, sharing stories and creating new memories. The remote control sits unused most of the time. They're too busy talking about life, dreams, and the endless ways that small acts of kindness can transform a community, one moment at a time. Sometimes, the greatest revelations aren't found in dramatic gestures or grand declarations, but in the simple choice to help someone in need. As Michael's grandfather wrote in another letter, found later among the preserved documents, "The future is built by those who choose kindness when no one is watching, who build bridges when others see only walls, and who remember that every moment carries the potential to change everything." The story of the teen who helped fix a TV became more than just a viral moment or a historical discovery. It became a reminder that in every community, on every street, the power to create change is always present, waiting only for someone to take that first small step toward connection.